So, Emma, you were fired from the UN for objecting to a secret policy of giving out the names of US and Canadian citizens, dissidents who are working with the UN. How is this possible? Tell me about how this happened.
It shouldn't be possible. It's very definitely against the rules. But basically, the Chinese delegation in Geneva would just write to the UN bureaucrats and say, "Hey, can you tell us if these dissidents are coming or not?" All of the UN human rights mechanisms are based in Geneva, and China didn't want to have its human rights record criticized, so they thought they would ask their friends at the UN for a favor. And instead of saying no, like the UN did for every other country that asked, they simply handed over names. And we're talking, as you said, about US citizens, Canadian citizens, UK, Germany, um, and the UN didn't inform any of those countries that this was happening. And in fact, when they challenged them about it, they simply lied. They claimed it never happened.
I can't help but notice that the US was at this time and remains the largest funder of the UN.
Yeah.
How does this work?
Well, the way it works essentially is that China's number two. And when the US, Canada, and other democracies give money to the UN, they usually do it in what's called unearmarked funds. So they essentially say, here's a blank check, spend this as you see fit. And the UN really encourages this, obviously, because they want to be able to use the money however they want to use it. Whereas when countries like China or Iran give money to the UN, it's very tightly stated in those agreements how exactly that's going to be spent. So, down even to things like when China gives money, it specifies every time that it cannot be spent in any country that has diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. So what that means is that in addition to all of the Chinese money depending on having diplomatic relations with China, you also have the UN development funds that are secretly dependent on that, even though it's not actually stated anywhere publicly. So all that the democracies see is that the money for small island developing states is fully funded this year by China. And what they don't see is that that means that any small island developing state that still has diplomatic relations with Taiwan will be under an enormous pressure to switch allegiance.
So many absolutely astonishing things you're telling me here. So this is official policy, yet it's secret. How do we know about it?
Because I told people. In 2012, I sort of thought I'd got my dream job working at the UN. And I was working with NGOs that were at the Human Rights Council. So I was their liaison in the Human Rights Council, and I received one of these emails. It was forwarded to me by my predecessor, essentially implying that I should hand over names. And I told her that that would not be happening. And essentially, a fiction was put on for me. This had actually been happening since 2006. And this was in 2013 when I first found out about it. But it was astonishing. They basically said, and my direct boss, a man called Eric Tistone, put it in writing that, it might exacerbate Chinese mistrust if we didn't give them the names.
Let me reiterate this. These are people who are, dissidents to communist China. In many cases, they've settled in the U.S. and Canada and other states. These are people that the Chinese Communist Party is looking to, at the very minimum, silence, if not, worse. And the
Yeah.
concern in writing was that it might make the Chinese feel bad.
Yeah, essentially, we might have to have an awkward meeting at which we said, this is against the rules, you can't have the names. Now, I was absolutely willing to have that awkward meeting. When you look at the sort of the emails that are exchanged back and forth, it's a bureaucratic decision. But it's not bureaucratic for the people's families who are still in China. Those people are arrested, they're pressured by the authorities. There have been cases of them being tortured, they've been imprisoned in concentration camps. Some of them have died in concentration camps. This is not some kind of anodyne action. And this is information being given to China exactly when it feels it needs it, weeks in advance of these people ever actually sort of showing up in Geneva to speak. So they have weeks to intimidate their family members still in China. And as I said, some of these people are US citizens. Others have permanent residency in the US because of their status as dissidents. And the UN is deliberately endangering US citizens. So, of course, I reported that to the US. And what happened next, essentially, was the US delegation in Geneva went to see the very man who was handing over names and asked him, "Are you doing this?" Now, very obviously, he has an interest in lying at that moment, and that's exactly what he did. And in sworn testimony, he admits that he lied to the US government about this policy. In all of their court filings, the UN admits this is ongoing policy. I wasn't fired for lying. I was fired for objecting to a policy of the Secretary General. And specifically listed in there was the fact that I had told the US delegation and Congress about it. So the UN essentially says that they have a right to lie to the US government, their largest donor, about handing over names of US citizens to the Chinese Communist Party, but that I had to be fired because I told them the truth.
Emma, just to kind of unpack this further, we're talking about the UN Human Rights Council, whose purpose is to safeguard human rights. It's to specifically to protect people in exactly these sorts of situations where they're from a regime that is known to do the most extreme of human rights violations. By giving those names out, those people's family members, if they're in China or friends or something, can be intimidated or harmed or whatnot, to basically prevent those people from doing the work they were going to be doing with the U.S. Human Rights Council in the first place. So,
Exactly.
Again, explain to me how this is possible.
I think it's possible because you have a lot of people in the UN who have a very comfortable life and who prioritize their personal comfort over other people's human rights. The UN works based on something called the noble mer principle, which says that the UN must always be the most attractive place to work. So we're paid better than US equivalent. We've got better benefits than the Swedish. The UN will cover private education up to the age of 25 for your kids anywhere on earth. You can go see any doctor anywhere on earth, anytime. It's all covered. It's a very comfortable life. And I think that a lot of people, unfortunately, will prioritize that. I mean, as I said in those emails, I was saying people will be tortured and killed as a result of this if you do this. And the response was we might have to have an awkward conversation with the Chinese ambassador. Even when I met directly at one point with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, to discuss this issue, to try to get him to act, and he told me it would be difficult because it's China. And, for context, some of the money that China gives to the UN goes directly to his office, $20 million a year. $10 million of that is to promote the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's official UN policy that must be promoted at all times, no matter how much of a debt trap it turns out to be. And another 10 million to whatever the Secretary General feels like spending that money on. And based on my conversation with him, where he didn't seem to care about the individuals whose names were being handed over, I would say China's getting its money's worth.
Tell me about your story. Dig into it a little bit more. So you were fired. What happened next?
Well, I technically shouldn't have been able to be fired because within the UN, one of the reforms that the US insisted on in the past was that the UN introduce whistleblower protection. This was after the oil for food scandal in Iraq. And the UN has always claimed to have this. Nobody actually gets whistleblower protection in the UN, but I did. I was one of the 2% of people that are recognized as a legitimate whistleblower that found a dangerous policy and reported it. So I should have been protected, but the UN decided to ignore its own rules. It was very blatant. So within the UN system, I had named a woman called Catherine Pollard, who's the head of management, as the person who was leading retaliation against me. So Catherine Pollard told everyone not to investigate the retaliation against me, placed me under investigation for having told the truth, so the act of whistleblowing essentially, and fired me for it. So I was simultaneously recognised as having told the truth to the US and that should be protected whistleblowing, and fired for whistleblowing. It really is Orwellian when you get into the kind of the ways the UN structures work. And it's that kind of absolute power on the part of the managers. And that's part of the problem, because everyone who works at the UN has diplomatic immunity, so they can't be held responsible in court. I mean, this policy is complicity in human rights violations. You know, if you give China a name of somebody and they go to that person's family and torture somebody, you're criminally complicit in that act. But even though it's an international crime, nobody at the UN can be held responsible. So you have this extreme level sort of power differential where you've got dissidents who cannot speak out in China, who've managed to leave the country in a lot of cases, or who are sort of descendants of migrants, who are in a position where they should be able to speak out, who are going to the one room on earth where you've got Chinese diplomats who are required to sit there and listen to dissidents talking about what's really happening. And then you've got these sort of very powerful bureaucrats that can essentially just ignore all of their rights because it's more convenient, because they don't feel like having an awkward conversation with an ambassador. And even though all of the rules say that technically the whistleblower should be protected, they can just ignore those too, because nobody's holding them to account. There needs to be accountability for the people who are committing the crimes.